This is an important show. Let's get right to it. The Vatican Summit on Sex Abuse and the Protection of Minors wrapped up in Rome this past week. Here to give us his journalistic perspective on the summit and what's happening in its aftermath is the National Catholic Register's Rome correspondent, Ed Pentin. Edward, thank you for being here. I want to begin by discussing the coverage and framing of this summit. Now, you started off by asking a question at one of the press conferences, which we've been talking about for weeks, maybe months. Watch.
When this meeting was initially announced, it was to be about the protection of minors and vulnerable adults, but now it seems to be only about protection of minors only. I just wanted to know, will this meeting include abuse of vulnerable adults, seminarians in particular?
The prudence that you need in confronting sexual abuse of minors will also serve you in confronting other types of misconduct.
Those other issues of misbehavior on the part of clerics with vulnerable adults or other adults are topics that need addressing. But we are focusing in these days on those who have so little voice. Young people, minors, don't have a voice, and they are kept in silence.
Was the whole focus here, Ed Pentin, too narrow? And does the Vatican have any sense of self-awareness that maybe by framing it this way, they were doing the church and maybe this summit a disservice?
Well, I think there was a bit of concern. I mean, as I said in my question, that when this meeting was announced, it was supposed to be for protection of minors and vulnerable adults. And then that title was changed after it had been announced, and people wondered why that was. Various theories exist about that, but it was rather odd. And I think people felt, well, if you're going to focus on this issue and then broaden it to the beneficial aspects of what's being discussed to other categories, then fine. But we never heard any reference to that later on in the meeting, and even at the end, there was never any reference about vulnerable adults really and seminarians and how to help rid the church of the abuse in that area. So it seemed to be very much a sort of deflection. I think people felt it was a deflection away from discussing what are very sensitive issues.
Yeah, and so many of the complaints that are coming forward and the allegations concern adults and really teens or older. So it seems there's a question here that does need addressing. Now, reporter Diane Montaigne asked a very important question. Listen.
More than 80% of the victims of these sexual offenders are teenagers of the male sex. Will the problem of homosexuality among the clergy be addressed?
I believe that it's important to admit the fact and recognize the fact of what you said in terms of the percentage of abuse involving male-on-male sex abuse. That is important. I think that has to be recognized. At the same time, as professional organizations studied the causes in context, such as the John Jay School of Criminal Justice and also the Royal Commission's report in Australia, indicated that homosexuality in itself is not a cause. It is a matter, however, of opportunity and also a matter of poor training on the part of people.
Several journalists raised this point about homosexuality and that it was being left out of the discussions. Archbishop Scicluna at one point said it has nothing to do with the sexual abuse of minors. Is that the official stance at the Vatican?
Yes, well, I think it is. It's I think that their feeling is that this issue is not it's not really part of the paedophilia crisis, and I think they feel that it's that's something else. And as I said earlier, that's why I think this issue was strictly kept to minors. They didn't want to broaden it to seminarians and vulnerable adults, because that would involve dealing with this issue of homosexuality. And so if you keep it to paedophilia, which the John Jay report and others say, well, it wasn't actually a homosexual issue, then that it enables them to avoid dealing with that issue.
Ed, 45-year Vatican veteran journalist Valentina Alves Arakis was one of the handful of women to participate in the summit. She challenged the bishops to decide whether they're on the side of the priests who are accused of abuse or those who cover up the crimes or the victims. She said this: we have decided which side to be on, warning that unless they side with victims, journalists who seek the common good will be your worst enemies. What was the reaction of that in the Vatican, among the bishops and the Pope himself?
Well, I think she's very much a respected journalist here. She's been on something like 150 papal flights, so she knows all the people very well. She knows the Pope well as well. And I think they heeded her words and respected them. But whether there will actually be any action taken to improve relations with the media on this, we'll have to wait and see. Certainly, it didn't seem that way at the final press conference, where it seemed to be very stage managed, and they did seem to see us rather as enemies rather than allies, and wanted to take seemed to be very sort of softball questions rather than the harder ones.
I want to move on to something that Delia Gallagher at CNN raised during a presser, and it runs to the heart of accountability. Listen to this.
In 2002, the U.S. cardinals, your brother cardinals, were over here under John Paul II. And at that time, the reassuring face of this crisis, that crisis and the continuing crisis, was Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. On Saturday, dismissed from the priesthood and was an abuser himself. How do you, amongst yourselves, cardinals, how are you holding each other accountable outside of the norms now? And how do you ensure the American people that what happened with your brother cardinals in 2002 is now going to change?
I and everyone else has to be held accountable, and I've always believed that. I think that I've lived my life in such a way that I take seriously my call to discipleship, my call, first of all, to be a baptized person before I'm ordained.
He never really answered the question, but how are they holding themselves accountable? Did anything change in the wake of this summit?
Well, there were proposals put forward, Raymond, to have metropolitan bishops really monitor the cases of bishops and hold them accountable. And there were other areas too to get the more lay involvement in monitoring bishops and also being parts of boards, which would also bring bishops to account. But but there wasn't really a lot that was concrete, and I think. That was a disappointment for people, that there wasn't much concrete that people could go home with. And I was talking to a bishop who said, well, this is just a starting point, and you've got to wait to the follow-up. And the trouble with you journalists is you want everything to be instant, and we have to wait and see how this develops. So
instant. It's been going on for decades.
Say, but yeah.
Well, prior to the summit,
I mean, that's the other argument.
Yeah, prior to the summit, Ed, Cardinals Raymond Burke and Walter Brandmuller wrote an open letter to the bishops attending the meeting, urging them to end their silence about the moral corruption in the church and return to upholding divine and natural law. Now, you interviewed Cardinal Brandmuller in the aftermath of this summit. What did he say to you, and what was your reaction?
Well, he was very disappointed. He said that they hadn't really tackled the pink elephant in the room, as some people call it, which is the homosexual one. He was quite concerned very concerned that issue wasn't adequately dealt with. And he said, but it's because this goes to the heart of the problem, especially the protectionist circles would have protected paedophile priests from any accountability. So he was very disappointed by that. But yes, but I think what was important about this open letter was that it really went to the deeper issues, which weren't actually talked about much, which were the doctrinal ones and the ignoring of moral doctrine and failure to uphold moral doctrine, and as they said, a turning away from the truth of the gospel. And I don't know if that was really dealt adequately in the meeting. I think a lot of people felt it wasn't, and even the issue of chastity, which we have a commentary in the Register says, that's the safest place for children is glorious chastity. That wasn't really mentioned, and the whole issue of sexual ethics and the teachings of the Church in this issue. So I think that was a concern too.
Is there a feeling in Rome and in the Vatican that they've put an exclamation point on this crisis, that it's over? They dealt with it, they had their summit, and now we can go back to planning papal trips to Zimbabwe?
Well, I mean, it might be that maybe the way they see it. I don't. It's hard to say. I mean, certainly there seems to be the perception that they're very committed to this. The words coming out of this conference were, enough is enough. We've got to sort this out. But as that bishop said earlier, we've got to wait and see. And as Archbishop Scicluna said, it's the follow-up that counts. But it's really up to probably the laity and us in the media to hold them to account and to make sure that these actions what they say is followed up by action.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, neither of us, neither the laity nor the media have the ability to discipline bishops. And as I've been saying from the beginning, it is bishops as the malefactors in this round of the crisis. That's what it was about, the misuse of power and particularly bishops who are not accountable to. Brother bishops can't discipline them. Only the Pope can do that. And that's why I was wondering what this summit was all about in the first place, because the Pope has all the cards and really all the power here. He can do this himself. Very quickly, an Italian Benedictine was chosen to lead the Lenten retreat in Rome. He's a rather odd choice in that he really doesn't have a background in this. He's not a theologian. What does this tell us about the Pope's particular approach to these sorts of matters?
Well, yes, he says that he was surprised that the Pope would ask him, and the Pope said, well, that's even more positive, that you don't have a profile of academic theology and so forth and giving retreats. So I think it's very much in keeping, though, with Pope Francis in that he sees sort of expertise as almost an obstacle to evangelization. And certainly when it comes to theology and doctrine, he sees that in some ways as an obstacle. He rather goes sort of heart to heart, as it were, rather than going through sort of theological theories and doctrine. So it's very much in keeping with that. But that has people support that, other people criticize it. There are pros and cons to that, I suppose. But it does seem rather odd, and I think it's caused him problems in the past because he's written documents like Amoris Laetitia. Also, the whole China issue was done without any consultation with some key dicasteries, particularly the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Although he consulted them, he didn't always listen to the changes that they wanted to put into these documents.
Ed Pentin, thank you as always for your columns at the National Catholic Register, and you can read them at ncregister.com, and for your great coverage always. Ed Pentin, thanks for being with us.